Yeah, so it's really interesting, and I think it's multifold. So we've got Russian propaganda. We're seeing this in the kind of EU and UK space, but then we're also seeing it in Ukraine. And I think it's good to separate those a bit to show how they're different. So first of all, if we look at the priority, which is what's happening in Ukraine, we're seeing Russian propaganda aim at two main things that we've seen anyway. First is around the kind of denialist content around human rights abuses. So say, for example, when Russia leaves a specific area that it's occupied for a while, we'll see Russia, or specifically the Kremlin, come out to undermine that evidence, to claim that videos are fake, photos are fake, photos that are essentially used as evidence of human rights abuses. The second way we see that in Ukraine is around Russia attempting to drive a wedge in between civilians and the government. So for example, by claiming, why are you supporting the government when you're going to have a really cold winter? Why are you supporting the government when actually look at what Russia's like and what life is like under Russian occupation? It's lovely and Kherson and things like that. Very much different to what we're really seeing on the ground, which is not that kind of nice life under Russian occupation. In the European context, however, we're seeing Russia drive narratives to stop that funding towards Ukraine. So for example, European countries such as Germany, Netherlands, France, but also the UK, we're seeing, and these are countries that are funding or providing support to Ukraine, right? Whether it be through arms, financial assistance and things like that. We're seeing Russia try to drive a wedge between civilians in those countries and those governments. So for example, in the UK, some of the Russian disinformation and propaganda that we're seeing is attempting to claim, for example, why would the UK government support a conflict when people at home cannot afford fuel prices or power prices or things like that? So the people in the UK are obviously getting annoyed at that by saying, well, actually, maybe Russia is right. Why is the UK government supporting the Ukraine war when at home we're unable to afford bread, milk, fuel and power, and we're going to have a very cold winter? So this is the element that Russia is trying to play on in that EU context. Very similar, but also quite different to what we're seeing in Ukraine as well. So I think the EU, and it's a really good question because countering that disinformation is important. You can't just stop it. So for example, we've seen EU obviously ban RT. UK has banned Russia Today, so that state broadcasting outlet. Now that's been an important move, but it's not stopping the flow of information. We're seeing that through pro-Russian Telegram groups, other agencies within the UK and the EU also promoting that content. So I think there's ways to actually show the real side of the conflict in Ukraine through the EU government and the UK government, to show what's really happening on the ground and why are those countries supporting the conflict in Ukraine. Why are those countries providing aid? One country has invaded another. We need to support that country in defense of its sovereign territory. That's why we're supporting them. That's why perhaps there might be higher gas prices because one country is holding gas hostage, essentially. So these sorts of things are important to counter by showing the facts, by showing the real story rather than letting that propaganda really sink in. Yeah, it's a really good question. So disinformation in Europe, obviously it's quite cutting edge, being that it's so close to the conflict in Ukraine, right? So we're seeing that sort of disinformation. In Australia, it's separate because Australia is actually quite similar to the US with Russian narratives. So in the US and Australia, we see the kind of narrative playing out where the Kremlin is promoting this narrative, and state media proxies of the Russian government are promoting this narrative that the Ukraine conflict is so far away from Australia. It's so far away from the US. It has nothing to do with the people that live in America or Australia whatsoever. So why are we funding it? Why are we sending money this way? Why should our people suffer when we send them that money? That's what's actually playing out. And there's a really interesting aspect because as an international community, everyone needs to stand with Ukraine, behind Ukraine, or support a country and its territorial sovereignty. And we've seen that in past conflicts as well, where Russia has moved in, occupied an area, or invaded a specific country. That country needs defending, and at this time, we haven't really done it too well before. We haven't defended those countries' sovereignties before, but at this time for Ukraine, perhaps it's the right choice for the international community to step up, whether it's the UK, whether it's Australia, whether it's the US, whether it's other countries in the UN General Assembly, for example, Southeast Asia, India, African countries as well, that need to support the UN General Assembly and Ukraine as well. My messages for journalists and media is to work together. So we've seen a number of different journalists and media organisations in certain parts of the EU and certain parts of the world bond together. And it's the first time we've really actually seen that as well. The Ukraine conflict has caused a lot of fatigue in newsrooms. Journalists are tired, they're burnt out from verifying information, they're burnt out from reporting on what is a 24/7 news cycle. But now they're actually bonding groups together and saying, rather than having separate Ukraine or separate Europe watch teams, let's have a whole watch team. Let's bond all these resources together, and then maybe if we have a big problem, we can break it apart and work on bite-sized solutions at each time. And I think that's what journalists need to do. No more competitiveness, but rather collaboration, because the problem is bigger than just one organisation. But together, maybe we can solve it.